Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll explore innovation on the Western Front in the Great War. From kit and equipment to tactics and techniques, we'll look at how and why innovation was so vital on the front lines. Hello, Dan. Pleasure to be joining you on another episode of Not So Quiet on the Western Front. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at a subject that I think is really interesting because it counters one of the most enduring myths of the First World War. We're going to be looking at the idea of innovation in the trenches, really at a frontline level. And I think this runs so contrary to the idea, very prevalent to this day, that in the First World War, the armies just kept doing the same thing over and over again without producing any different results. But as we're going to show, in fact, innovation was present in the armies really from the first shots of the war to the very end.
Yeah, hi Spence. Going to be, as you say, a really interesting subject to cover. There's so many different angles we can approach this one from, actually. You know, I think in this we'll maybe dip into a few different areas and look at innovation from different approaches. But yeah, I'm 100% in agreement with you. And in a sense, I don't really know why the First World War sticks out in this way. I think to a certain extent, if you kind of boil it down and look at the big picture of the Great War, quite often we see people talking about going over the top day after day. It's that old, maybe it's part of the Blackadder story for our British listeners here. The idea of Douglas Haig sending men over the top without ever changing tactics. Now, hopefully by this point in the podcast, if you've made it this far in sequence, we've kind of dispelled that myth to a certain extent. But it really does linger. And there are things from the very, very minute details right up to the real big picture that we can, I think, drop into and dispel those myths straight away. I mean, there's so many to choose from, but let's start, since we're on the front lines, with the stuff that soldiers have in the front lines with them. And we can see a very direct line drawn from experiences on the Western Front and then things coming about to either protect the soldiers or to make them more efficient in their role. And you can see it on kit, uniforms, and equipment really straight away.
You can. And this is something that perhaps one of the most obvious and in some ways enduring changes of innovation with regards to the First World War. When the war begins in 1914, most armies have got some form of uniform that is drab or is designed to provide a certain degree of cover. So, for example, the British are fighting in khaki, the Germans are fighting in field grey, and so on. But perhaps most famously, the French army actually goes to war in a very colourful uniform, especially its cavalry, but also its infantry, of blue jackets and the famous red trousers of France with polished brass buttons as well. And these uniforms really got a long lineage in French military history, stretching way back to the 1800s. But very quickly, these uniforms are found to be completely inadequate for modern warfare. You can see these men in these colourful uniforms a very long way away. And as ranges of weapons have increased so much in 1914, being seen at a long distance means you're going to be under fire at a very long distance and you'll start taking casualties. And really, as quickly as September 1914, the French military is saying this uniform is not adequate. It's causing us problems. Interestingly enough, it's more so the brass buttons and the brass lapels that are the problem, more so than the red trousers, because red trousers quickly get muddy, people lie down, can't see them in that position, but the shiny buttons are noted by the Germans as giving away the presence of French infantry all the time. And so very quickly there's a change in how the French are going to approach their uniform, and they're moving towards what will eventually be the horizon blue uniform, which is the standard uniform of the French in the First World War. And this is part of a wider recognition, changing colours, changing the nature of the uniform to try and emphasize at first just not being seen. If you can't be seen, or at least you're difficult to see, you provide a small measure of protection for your soldiers. And the speed with which the French adopt this and introduce this change, I think is really remarkable, given how important their traditional French uniform is to the French military mind.
Yeah, of course, there's that famous phrase where a general was supposed to have said in about 1914, in response to the suggestion that the uniform should be changed, my God, the French army is red trousers. That was kind of encapsulating the famous esprit de corps. I'll throw this one out there, though, Spence, and I have to say I absolutely cannot back this up in any way, shape or form, but I like the story. Maybe some of you listeners out there can either confirm or contradict this one. The general story that I've heard, and it is a fairly well-told story out amongst battlefield guides on the Western Front, is in fact that red dye that's used by the French in 1914 is sourced from the Germans prior to 1914, and when war is declared, that dye is no longer easily accessible. What is accessible, supposedly, is the Royal Navy's blue, but not in huge quantities, so a diluted version is used in order to create horizon blue. Now, I like the story. I've got no idea if it's true or not. Maybe you guys can tell us. But it does, as you rightly said, Spence, point out that there are, of course, immediately changes. I think what's interesting, as you say, about those polished brass buttons is, of course, there are many other units on the battlefield with things that rattle and shine. And we know today, and very famously in the Second World War, everything is dulled down. But really on the battlefield in the First World War, even that happens. I'm thinking of officers who go out and private purchase their uniforms. They'll often have what they call the football-style buttons, which are a leather-covered button, which, again, take away that rattle and shine of things. And these little changes we see, and I suppose sticking, Spence, with officers' uniforms, one of them that we see, which is much appreciated by a number of officers, is the move away from cuff rank in the First World War to a shoulder rank.
This is very true. And really, this is, in some ways, certainly in the British perspective, this is a little bit of relearning a lesson. Because in the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, British officers had found themselves being prime targets for Boer snipers. Because it was obvious when you were an officer, you'd be wielding a sword, you'd be wearing a badge of rank, you'd be really easy to mark out, and then a marksman would pick you off. And in the Boer War, the British had moved to actually putting rank badges on the back of officers, on the back of their collar, and abandoning the swords. In fact, an officer going into action with a sword was very unusual by the latter stages of the Boer War. But then those ideas had slowly been lost. Now, there were problems actually with having rank on your back. It was sometimes difficult for a man to see who you were, and it was difficult for them to follow their officers. But the return to older-fashioned methods and the more prominent badges of rank very quickly in 1914 marks you out for being killed. And anybody who's a marksman or a good shot in the enemy line is going to see you. They're going to recognize you. You're going to be very distinctive based on your uniform and probably the fact you're wielding a sword. And they're going to do their very best to shoot you down. In the British Army, for example, facing the Germans in 1914, in some battalions, the best marksmen are told, fire independently. Don't join the main body of the battalion firing. We want you to look for prime targets. And the prime targets they look for are officers, signallers, machine gun teams. So there's a whole range of people looking for officers. And very quickly, the officer casualties that are suffered in 1914 in all armies are absolutely unsustainable. If you're an officer, you are expected to lead from the front, but the least you can do is at least make yourself a little bit less conspicuous. And this also carries on into 1915 as the trenches begin to appear. Snipers, who of course infest no man's land, they're looking for officers. If you can shoot an officer, that's going to do more damage to the enemy than if you shoot a common rifleman or a common soldier. And so quickly, the officers have to alter their uniforms, which it seems now, as we sit here, it seems, well, this is so obvious. Why is this a challenge? Think, listeners, about what a change this is to decades, if not centuries of tradition. This is the style of wearing your rank that it goes back to the Napoleonic Wars, a century earlier. And now suddenly, due to the conditions of war, you're having to change it. You're having to move it, make it a little bit less conspicuous. And this is a big cultural change for armies, which by nature are conservative. But what's driving this change, and I think this is an important part, Dan, is the need for survivability. And when your life's on the line, when the future of your nation, when the fate of your army is on the line, well, conservatism on tradition doesn't really have a place for it. So the French change their uniforms, officers change where their rank badges are held, and also armies, driven by this need to try and preserve soldiers' lives, start to introduce something that's really important for soldier survivability, and that's armoured helmets.
Yeah, it's a huge change in terms of the story of the Great War. And we could no doubt, I know this is an old phrase now, but we could certainly do an entire episode on helmets and this kind of thing in the Great War. It's one of those things that again, looks pretty obvious. And in fact, in way, shape, and form, over some several thousand years, there have always been helmets of some kind. Most guys go into the Great War, as we know, with something that is certainly not bulletproof. In fact, everybody finishes the Great War with something that is not bulletproof. What it might be is shrapnel or deflected brick proof that's going to stop getting you killed. But if you get shot in the steel helmet by anything like a rifle or a pistol in the Great War, that's still going to be game over, even right to the end of the war. But we actually see this first come about in about 1915, early 1915. To my recollection, at least, Spence, the very first thing is a little French thing called la cigarette, which is actually a metal kind of skull cap that goes inside the kepi, the famous French cloth cap, and it literally gets threaded inside, almost like a liner. Le secret, of course, being the secret because it's not visible. And the idea is this is going to provide some basic protection against, let's face it, by far the most exposed part of your body in trench warfare, which is going to be your head. So these kind of things come about very quickly. Of course, the French are then going to bring out the famous Adrian helmet, arguably the best helmet of the Great War. And the Brits are going to follow suit fairly quickly with what we know as the Brodie, which I believe is a Canadian design originally. And following that, of course, in fact, about the same time, the Germans are going to bring out the Stahlhelm, which has got very good protection, particularly around the neck and kind of flared out on the sides. Most modern armies today will use some kind of variation of that kind of Stahlhelm shape or steel helmet. But just remember, in 1914, the Germans are going to war with a Pickelhaube, a hardened leather helmet with a big pointy spike on top. Now, that's maybe great in the early Napoleonic Wars when that spike is used to deflect cavalry swipes down from a great height to try and hit people on the head, and it will deflect that point across. But over the decades in between the Napoleonic Wars up to the start of the First World War, that's become a hollow spike that actually has no defensive properties whatsoever. And now it's just something that's sticking over the top of trenches. So you can understand why these kind of things come in. And the idea, I think, Spence, of preservation generally in the First World War is something that is going to be the big motivator and the big driver to innovation, because it's the reason that things evolve. It's the reason we have learning curves. It's the reason we see new weapons brought out. What we need to, I think, keep sight of is the fact that the great commodity of the First World War are the men that are doing the fighting. And the more of those guys you can keep alive, the better your chance of winning.
Absolutely right. The casualties of 1914 and indeed 15 are absolutely staggering and stunning. And one thing that I think we can forget is that although there are certainly those who regard these casualties rather callously and don't really think that much about them, even the most callous observer, the most callous commander or callous politician has to acknowledge the fact that if you keep losing all your men, you cannot win the war. You have to seek preservation. You have to do something to try and save lives and preserve your soldiers. Otherwise, you'll just lose the war through sheer attrition. And so the introduction of camouflaged or at least semi-camouflaged uniforms, the reduction in items that are going to make you obvious as an officer, the introduction of helmets to protect you, especially from shrapnel bursts. Shrapnel bursts above you, it's most likely to hit your head, and if you've got some sort of armoured protection there, it won't necessarily stop you being injured by the shrapnel, but it does a good job at stopping you being killed by it, and it's extremely important in that sense. And so all the armies move towards this, and this is really quite an innovative move. But there's another factor that, of course, we keep coming back to. We've mentioned several times the lethality of fighting on the battlefield of 1914-15 and onwards. It's such a deadly environment. It's much more deadly than any war that's been seen previously. Your casualty rates are higher. The amount of bullets and explosives on the battlefield are much higher. And so you can go to some length to protect your soldiers. You make them a little bit harder to see. You can give them some protection on their head. Body armor is experimented with. In fact, you can buy private purchase body armor in all the combatant nations, especially Britain and to a lesser extent, America. You can buy basically a suit of armor. It's a breastplate and a backplate that you wear under your uniform. And they come in a variety of types. You can get leather and wool-packed ones. They're not so great. And apparently they're very hot and they sweat you. You can get ones that are made of a very dense layered leather. Probably might be useful in a hand-to-hand combat, but not going to stop a bullet or a piece of shrapnel, really. And you can also buy metal ones. Now, these metal ones are very heavy. The breastplate alone weighs about 20 pounds. And if you wear the full set, you're putting 40 pounds of weight onto you. So you better be a big, strong guy. So body armor isn't really available. And in fact, although the German army will officially issue body armor to its stormtroopers in 1917 and 1918, there's lots of experiments with body armor. Certain specialist units get given body armor. So trench mortar teams, we'll come on to trench mortars later, who were always under heavy fire, actually get issued with body armor so they can stay in action a little longer. But in general, the move in the First World War is not to armor up your infantry because technology is not really there. It's too heavy for them. They can't move. They slow them down and they just get stuck or exhausted in no man's land. Instead, the move is very much to try and lighten a soldier's load so that they can move faster. We've mentioned before in this podcast, speed kills in the First World War. Speed of operation is what's the key to victory ultimately. But also, if you're going very slowly, that's going to get you into lots of trouble. And this leads to the development of light fighting order.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting one as well, and something that we see really between the period of about the Battle of Loos and the opening day of the Battle of the Somme in September. A couple of famous instances of this. And again, there's a little bit of obvious logic. You can almost look back and say, well, why weren't they doing that already? And quite simply what we're talking about here is detaching any of the unnecessary equipment from your webbing, basically the set of webbing that you wear, various different packs, detachable, changeable, and just taking everything off that you don't need in order to make you faster on the battlefield. Typically, you might keep a few rations. You're certainly going to keep your ammunition, and you're going to keep your water bottle. And that's really light fighting order. So all of your pack, your spare clothing, any extra items that you don't need, they come off, and it means you can go into the attack, be a little more mobile, be a little more versatile, but still continue the fight. Now, we see this in a couple of different ways. It really is first actually trialled at the Battle of Loos, opening day of the Battle of Loos in September of 1915. And it is found to be quite effective. In the northern sector where the assault on the Hohenzollern Redoubt goes on, that's pretty effective. One of the problems that's found out very quickly, though, is a lot of that material that's required in order to hold on to gained ground is not kept by troops who are moving with light fighting order. So the idea of going up, not necessarily having a spare shovel or an entrenching tool or any of the heavy kit that's required, amongst others, to reverse a trench, is really problematic. So what we tend to see is guys get in, as they do at the Hohenzollern Redoubt and various other locations. They can hold, but they can only hold for a certain period of time. And in Loos, because light fighting order's only really been trialled at that point, there's not really any, if you like, any follow-up thought or enough follow-up thought given to it. What we do find in the Somme is that those lessons are learned, and it's perhaps one of the big lessons. Light fighting order should be used by troops in the front line where at all possible in order to get across that famous race to the parapet as quickly as possible. What then happens is the supporting waves will bring up additional kit and equipment once that initial gain has been made, and then be able to hopefully repair, fix, reverse trenches, also defend, of course, against those famous counterattacks coming in. So there is considerable thought and innovation on the battlefield, and light fighting order, I think, is a really good one. I just want to wind the clock back, Spence, and throw this one over to you, though, because one thing that always sticks in my mind when we look at casualty numbers of the Great War, and it's true for any army, of course, I guess we often focus on the big attacks that come in. So the opening day of the Battle of Somme, the Battle of Loos or Verdun, we look at the casualty numbers from that point of view. What I find really interesting, I've done in the past, is to pick a random day on the Western Front of the Great War and look at the casualty numbers for a day when nothing goes on. And it's still potentially several hundred. These are several hundred people killed up and down the line on a normal day. This is the famous attrition of the Western Front. And to my mind, at least, a lot of this innovation is driven by that attritional loss. You know, just the tick over, the churn rate, if you like, and things that come about that are particularly interesting. That one of them would be something like the trench periscope.
This is a really interesting point, and it builds on this theme of armies have to try and find ways to protect soldiers. And again, I really want to emphasize this point that armies are not totally callous to their casualties. They don't want to keep losing men in battle, and they especially don't want to keep losing them in what you've just well described as just the daily attrition. The attrition caused by snipers, by the sudden bombardment. A fusillade of machine gun fire suddenly sweeps over a trench and kills one or two people. And so there's methods start to get introduced to protect soldiers. We've already discussed trenches in a previous episode. In some ways, they're the biggest expression of how do you protect a soldier. You get them to dig in. But then operating in a trench and protecting yourself in a trench becomes really important because trenches alone do give you some protection. But in the context of the First World War, they need to be developed even further. And so what you see is a problem. How do you actually look out of a trench without exposing the top of your head to enemy snipers, enemy marksmen, or even just the random bursting of mortars and shrapnel? And this leads to the invention of the trench periscope. And the exact origins of the trench periscope are a little bit obscure. There may have been a form of trench periscope as early as the American Civil War during the siege of St. Petersburg. A very crude device. Effectively, you put two mirrors in a wooden tube and you use them to reflect, and you can put it on the side of the periscope and you can look out and you can see into no man's land. You can see the opposition trenches. May have been used as early as 1864 and 1865, but by the time of the First World War, they've become a standard piece of equipment. Initially, interestingly enough, and this is very interesting, I think, from this innovation perspective, certainly in Britain, the first trench periscopes are probably army issued, but then there's this real thriving private sector of trench periscopes. You can buy them in Britain, and when you ship out as an officer to the Western Front, well, you've got one with you. You can buy them in France and take them with you to the Western Front. And there's even a thriving, we'll get into this a little bit later in the episode, there's a thriving industry behind the front lines that makes bits of trench equipment. But a trench periscope of the First World War is more advanced than the American Civil War version. It functions like a submarine periscope. You attach it to the side of the trench, you wind it up, and it will slowly rise above the trench line, because you don't want it above the trench line constantly, because then it will be seen and somebody will shoot it, inevitably. Line it up, you take a peek through it. Now, initially, these trench periscopes, you can just see dead ahead, but that's found to be not supremely useful because you're not that high above the trenches. You're basically just seeing broken ground and barbed wire in front of you. Later, due to configurations of mirrors in there, you get different views. You can see a bit higher up, for example. And they become absolutely pivotal in the war. Everybody uses them. All the combatant nations use them. They become more and more advanced. In fact, the German trench periscopes are probably the most advanced of all. They have the best lenses in them. And these periscopes develop as the war goes on, from just devices where you can see into the enemy or have a look at the enemy in no man's land, to devices where they have range finders within the periscope so you can gauge ranges and this sort of thing. They get issued to artillery. They get issued to the infantry. They become this really pivotal piece of equipment. I actually think, though, trench periscopes aren't really one of the best known pieces of equipment in the First World War. There aren't that many surviving examples. You don't see that many photographs of them, but they're really important. If you want to know what's going on in no man's land and you don't want to be shot in the head, you need a trench periscope. But this hadn't really been considered at all prior to the war. It's a wartime innovation.
What you said there about this idea of an industry striking up behind the lines, but also back at home, is really interesting. If anybody ever gets a chance to look through, for example, wartime local newspapers, before the war, you see clothing coupons and ladies' dresses and things advertised in local newspapers. From 1914, 15, 16, 17, all you see is adverts for body armor or cholera belts or special pills and tinctures that are particularly good for fortifying the humours when in trench warfare. It's amazing how there must have been huge amounts of money made in doing this. Of course, it does create its own industry of a kind, and you can totally get it as well, because mum behind the line with 18-year-old Tommy in the trenches is certainly going to, if she can afford it, expend that little bit of money to provide private kit to keep him alive. And you totally get that. I think, though, trench periscopes, Spence, is one of those examples of an item like that, are a great example of how innovation is used in a defensive measure, typically defensive, not exclusively, of course. But if we look at the other side of the line, of course, the two opponents have got opposing aims. One of them is to protect their own troops. The second is to inflict attrition on the enemy. And there are different ways to do that. And you get this tit-for-tat nature, which I think really underscores the entire of innovation in the Great War. If the Brits are now a couple of hundred yards away, how are we going to be able to inflict attrition on them? And at the very early part of 1915, you get all sorts of things coming about, really ad hoc, kind of Heath Robinson ideas. I'm thinking about things like catapults, which can throw grenades further than a typical man can. There's some great examples of this kind of stuff.
There is, and it starts really quickly. As soon as the troops stop moving around in front of each other, as soon as they start digging in, requests start going back, bring me this equipment. One of my favourite memoranda from the British Army is actually issued in October 1914 by a sort of personal military hero of mine, Brigadier General Charles Fitzclarence, VC, Anglo-Irish officer who'd won the Victoria Cross in the Boer War. He's the highest ranked officer who's commemorated on the Menin Gate, marking the fact that he has no known grave. But he actually orders the very first British trench raid of the entire First World War in 1914. It succeeds, and then afterwards he writes a memorandum that he sends back up the chain of command saying, we're in trench warfare now, this is the equipment that we need. And it is very far-sighted. It's essentially a memorandum that predicts everything he's going to need. But one thing that he really wants is, as he writes, weapons that can worry the Germans in their trenches. And he identifies two in particular, rifle grenades and mortars. And the story of mortars in the First World War, I think, is super interesting because on the West, the only army that's gone to war with mortars are the Germans. They have their Minenwerfers, their mine throwers, in a variety of calibers, highly effective weapons. They're ranging from really big ones, some of which are even mounted on railway carriages, down to man-portable ones you can take into the front line. But the British don't have any mortar at all. In fact, they've rejected the idea of mortars. They think they're a really old-fashioned weapon, more suitable for siege warfare in the 1800s. But clearly, once the trench lines form, you've got to have, as you say, Dan, some way of, inflicting attrition on the enemy in front of you. And so various experiments to try and create something like a mortar follow very quickly. You mentioned these catapults, and there's some photos of those out there. They are literally like the catapult you might have played with as a child, or you might have seen one as a child. Literally a Y-shaped piece of frame with a big piece of rubber between it. You put a grenade in it, you fuse it, so it's about to go off, you pull it back, and then you fling it with a kapwing, and it flies into the enemy's trench. Massively inaccurate, completely useless, really, almost embarrassingly primitive. But the fact that that gets invented, so to speak, by the British very quickly shows that down in the trenches, people are thinking about how to make this equipment. We need this equipment. We don't have it. How do we make it? So trench catapults give way to British improvised trench mortars. It's actually the Indian Expeditionary Force that invents the first of these on the Western Front for the British. And they're just a length of pipe with a fuse. They're super crude devices, but at least they're functional and you can make them. Interesting anecdote to this is the British actually capture an example of a German mine thrower in 1914, and the engineers take a look at it, the artillery take a look at it, they're extremely impressed, and the commander of the British Army at the time, John French, actually sends this mortar back to the Ordnance Department in the UK with instructions saying, make us an exact copy of this, as many of these as you can. And there's a long correspondence then from the Ordnance Department saying, well, we can't actually do this because the Germans own the patent on this particular design, and we can't breach patent law. Even in the midst of a war that's killing hundreds of thousands, you have to respect patent law in Britain. So it's not copied, but instead designs are developed. And it goes from these very crude, incredibly crude weapons that just are tubes that fire, to more and more advanced models that are slowly developed until eventually you hit upon the standard British mortar, the Stokes mortar, which is about a 3-inch mortar, hugely effective, mass-produced. That's the British view, but the French approach to mortars, I think, in some ways is even more interesting because the French look back in time for their mortars and, of course, dug out some vintage weapons, which actually are pretty devastating.
Yeah, absolutely. The famous heavy French trench mortars, which are used with such devastating effect. I know we covered them briefly in our artillery episode, have huge potential to just destroy big chunks of trench line. And of course, if you happen to find yourself in any position like that, you're going to be killed outright. It really is a horrific amount of damage that can be done. And as far as these kind of examples go, and I think the one that you've pointed out there, Spence, particularly mortars, is a great example of this tit for tat, because there are, of course, defensive measures put in place. But even before that, I think there are individual troops on the front lines seeing opportunities. One of the examples that sticks in my mind, it's not dissimilar to mortars in a way, but is really interesting, is the idea of grenades. And of course, grenades are something that have been around since the 1700s. They've been used fairly regularly, and they've really fallen out of favour in the pre-war years. But when trench warfare comes along, all of a sudden, when you're looking for a weapon that's not necessarily something that you need to be in direct line of sight for the enemy, it all of a sudden comes back into favour. And the reason behind it is fairly logical. If you want to shoot somebody in 1914, you need to be able to see them through your crosshairs. And if you can see them, you can be pretty sure that they can see you. And it makes it very, very deadly. What you can do with grenades in trench warfare, or in positions where you can at least get yourself to within range of the enemy trench, is throw something which can cause damage or death to the enemy from a position of cover into their position. All of a sudden, you don't need to be looking at the enemy to do that. And I'm sure it needs no further explanation as to why that's a popular thing in the Great War. But of course, the British Army don't go to war in 1914 with a grenade. The Germans have various versions of grenades that they use, an egg bomb, a discus grenade, both of which are fairly useless actually in trench warfare. The French are going to adapt something called the lemon grenade. But really, the British journey, I think, is particularly interesting because we get, first of all, this idea of a jam tin bomb. This is taking some kind of explosive charge, filling a literal jam tin with bits of nails, scraps of metal, perhaps shrapnel balls, whatever you can get hold of that's going to do a bit of damage, maybe even stone in some cases, wiring that shut, putting a fairly crude Tom and Jerry style fuse in, lighting the fuse, hurling it towards your enemy, and hoping it goes off in a generally dangerous situation somewhere near your enemy. Well, these things are pretty damn dangerous to everybody involved, probably more so to the guy that's throwing the thing. And so very quickly we see this evolution. We see something called the cricket ball grenade come out, which is again fused. It's a round iron ball in this case, and it's got a hollow shell with a charge in the center. Problem is, this thing is used with a friction igniter, literally a wristband that you'll wear on your wrist, and you'll strike it to ignite the charge before throwing it away. Well, as the Brits find out in 1915, to their cost, if that friction igniter gets wet, it's not lighting. And so before long, we're actually going to see, I think, probably the stable and something you still see on the battlefields to this very day. And it's a real big change, at least from the British point of view, and that's going to be the Mills bomb on the battlefield. And they can do some real damage, Spence.
They can, and what's interesting, especially interesting, I think, about the British story with grenades is how ill-prepared British industry is to actually produce grenades on scale. And brilliantly laid out, the Germans go to war with a variety of grenades, but quickly find that the Model 24, the famous potato masher grenade, is really going to be highly effective. Big blasting charge, very reliable. Its stick shape means you can throw it a long way. You actually don't need to be particularly strong with it. It's quite aerodynamic. The French lemon grenade is also effective. You can throw it a long way. Not the biggest blasting charge, but it will do damage. Whereas the British do actually have a pre-designated grenade in 1914, the Humble Mark I. And it looks exactly like a German stick grenade. It's actually an incredibly advanced design because it's a percussion grenade. And that means that it's designed to explode when it hits something. It's not fused on a timer. It's designed to detonate on impact. And you actually have a leather strap that you wrap around your wrist, and you use it a bit like an old-fashioned slingshot. You spin it around and you throw it. You can get a long range with it. Problem is, the British Army goes to war with maybe a few dozen of these grenades, and they're specialist weapons used only by the Royal Engineers. Totally useless in the kind of mass warfare you're going to see. And it's a very advanced design, but in the trenches it's useless because you can't spin it properly, so you can't throw it very far. If it lands in soft mud, it doesn't detonate very well, and they're very, very expensive to manufacture as well. They're very precision. So the army abandons these, but it can't make its own grenade. It can't make a good grenade, I should say, for about a year. And so you get these trench workshops behind the lines, which are producing grenades. And you mentioned the jam tin bombs, literally jam tins, fuse with some explosive, and an exposed fuse that you light, usually with a cigarette or your pipe. Not very efficient at all. But the fact that the army, it's not being supplied properly from Britain, has to just innovate at a real ground level, has to invent and design and produce these weapons, is really interesting because it shows that innovation is coming from below. And what actually happens is grenades that prove reasonably effective, or at least the design that's reasonably effective in 1915, are usually ones that are being made by Royal Engineers behind the lines. And then those designs get sent back to Britain and they're produced on a larger scale. Eventually, British industry will produce the Mills bomb, But right as late as the Somme, in fact, the British Army is still using a strange mix of grenades. Mills bombs, Mark 1s, those very advanced grenades, which are only used for specialist tasks, plus a few of what are called the ball grenade, which has got a big exposed fuse coming out of it. And afterwards, those grenades all got the more outdated grenades get shipped to Russia, incidentally, and get used in a large number of them get used in the Brusilov offensive. So they're still being used there. But the key point is these are innovations from below. And I think this is a theme we're discussing here. Periscopes initially are being sold to you by private industry. Trench mortars are being built in the trenches, or they're being dragged out of old French fortresses. Grenades are being innovated, being created. And one thing that I think we are apt to forget is the armies of the First World War, especially down at ground level, it's a matter of life or death whether you can innovate. And those small advantages can mean the difference between victory and defeat. And what the armies start to generate is an innovation mindset. And I think that's something we're so apt to forget. We're so locked in the idea that the armies just did the same thing over and over again with the same result. But down at the ground level, there is constant innovation. And we see it on all sides, Dan.
Yeah, and what's really intriguing is that it doesn't actually stay at ground level throughout the Great War. You could absolutely understand why it starts there, as you've very clearly explained. These are the guys on the front line who are going to be the victims of lack of innovation. They're going to be the first ones to be exposed against new weapons and to have to encounter new dangers on the battlefield. But what we see, and maybe we can bring this back to the famous learning curve, that famous phrase that we use so often when we're talking about the Great War, is the fact that really by we get to the point of sort of towards the end of 1915, it's not necessarily you as a soldier that needs to learn from the negative experience of being under fire by a new weapon or a new innovation on the battlefield. What we start finding is a more formalized structure on the Western Front. So, okay, a battalion on our left may have encountered flamethrowers for the first time. Well, by the time we make our way through the war, thankfully, your battalion doesn't necessarily need to learn by first-hand experience what it's like to be shot at with a flamethrower, because actually that information starts to be passed in between different battalions in the line. There's a bit of a formalized structure that grows up here. And I think this is maybe something that's quite often overlooked, Spence. It even brings about specialist departments which are looking at ways to inform, improve, and then disseminate information back to different units on the front lines.
It does. And just to give the British example of this is an organisation that's formed in 1915, and it's called the Trench Warfare Department, or TWD. And the Trench Warfare Department, it's a Royal Engineer-driven department, because in 1915, it's not just a department for innovation and collecting information. There's also an expectation that the Royal Engineers will build something related to this. And the Trench Warfare Department is one of the sort of forgotten aspects of certainly the British side of the First World War, because it is a clearinghouse for ideas. And what's fascinating is it is so open to innovation and so open to ideas. Quite literally, the Trench Warfare Department, if you write to them, doesn't matter what you write to them with, and there's some real harebrained ideas get sent by various people. You can write to them, whether you're a serving soldier in the front line, or if you're somebody in the UK who just happens to have a good idea, or someone in the wider British Empire, you can write to the Trench Warfare Department with your suggestion. And it produces all kinds of ideas. People write in with weapons ideas and equipment ideas. Now, some of these are just totally impractical. They're just not going to work. But others have got something about them, and people start to think about them. People write in and talk about very technical issues, such as the composition of explosives in a grenade, or the velocity that's produced by certain artillery pieces firing. Other people write from the front line and say, look, we've got a real problem with this. We're finding it difficult to deal with this. We really need something done. An example of the latter is the need for close combat trench weapons. We've discussed in the previous episodes about trenches that once you're actually in a trench, fighting in a trench is really difficult and horrible. It's narrow, it's often battle damaged by the time you're in there, point blank fighting, and it's so narrow and clustered in there that fighting with your rifle and bayonet is often quite difficult. You can take the bayonet off and use it as a sort of short stabbing weapon, but that's not ideal either. And so there's requests to go back to the Trench Warfare Department that generated really by British experience in trench raiding and being raided by the Germans in return, saying we need close combat trench weapons. And the Trench Warfare Department responds by manufacturing, building behind the lines a variety of weapons from bladed knuckle dusters. So it's a set of knuckle dusters, punch someone in the face with them, and there's a small cutting knife down at the bottom of your hand. Pretty ghastly, but used in gang warfare, incidentally, in the streets of London, Birmingham, and Manchester prior to the First World War. So there's those. There's trench clubs. Got all kinds of nicknames. The British tend to know them as knobkerries after the Zulu war club they'd faced in South Africa. Literally a length of wood. You put something pretty heavy on the other end, spiked maybe, if you really want to do some damage, and you use it as a club. And they come in a variety of sizes. Relatively small ones, you use them like a kosh, bring it down on the back of a sentry's head, or big ones, swing it at a German. Even if they're wearing a helmet, it'll go through that helmet. Other weapons are produced, trench hatchets, trench daggers, trench varieties of trench cutting implements as well. And these are all being produced because soldiers in the front line are saying, look, we really need a good close combat weapon. Officially, the British Army doesn't recognise any weapon for close combat in the trenches apart from your bayonet and your potentially a revolver. But in reality, there is a thriving industry behind the lines producing these. The French also do the same, the Americans do the same, and the Germans do the same as well. So they're all producing these weapons behind the lines. And officially, you're not supposed to use them. The army doesn't recognize their existence. In reality, lots of people are now packing useful weapons for fighting in close quarters. And that's just one example. There's dozens of examples we could draw from the trench warfare department and all this information that's coming to it. And bear in mind that the other armies have these too. Of course, sometimes it can go a little bit too far, and some of the suggestions that get sent in are clearly not going to work. But sometimes people take interest in them, and there's a very famous and absolutely true anecdote that Douglas Hay, commander of the British Army in 1916 and to the end of the war, he gets taken in 1916 by a British charlatan, con man, who convinces him that he has a death ray that's based on X-rays, which he says kills rats in seconds, and that he can turn it into a weapon, and he's going to X-ray, he's going to fire this death ray at the Germans, and it's going to kill them in the dozens, in the hundreds. Of course, it doesn't work. This guy's a con man. He's just out for money. And there certainly are a handful of those ideas that hit the trench warfare departments but don't go any further. But until the armies get really organised at home, until production really ramps up, it's essential that these trench workshops are producing weapons and equipment because that's your main source. And it's not just innovating and building, it's also repairing your weapons once they're broken or you've got a problem with them. Take them back to your trench workshop and they'll slap a bit of paint on it, they'll fix it, and they'll send you back out. And so innovation at the front line is really key. It's a real churning process because if you are being attacked by an enemy who's got close combat trench weapons and you don't have them, well, you're in grave danger. So there's a sort of arms race of innovation down at a very tactical level.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to this tit for tat kind of look that we've seen. I mean, we've seen this with aircraft, fighter aircraft in the Great War. We've seen it with artillery. We've seen it with evolution in no man's land itself. And I wonder if we follow that same thread for a second, Spence, and think about what it would be like to be on the receiving end of a trench raid if you were perhaps a German soldier or perhaps a British or American soldier receiving a German trench raid. Because of the sheer ferocity and the danger and frankly, the fear of trench raids, whether they're launched or not in the Great War, there are, of course, defensive measures that come about. And if you just think for a second about the practicality of getting into an enemy trench, first of all, you've got the inevitable barbed wire that you've got to manage to get your way through. Well, barbed wire, of course, evolves in a huge way throughout the Great War. Its volume, really, up to 1917 is the thing that we see most evolution in. But we also see early warning defenses on there. We see quite crude things like tins of jam tins, perhaps again, with a load of stones in it. So if you cut a bit of barbed wire, or you cut a bit of line, that tin will rattle. It's going to alert the guys that something's going on, particularly at night out in no man's land. Sometimes bits of gravel or broken glass are thrown down. Sometimes they're there anyway. But you've got all kinds of things that happen. Another one that sticks in my mind here, Spence, is the idea of hanging up something called grenade netting, which is in effect chicken wire, which goes over the top of your trench. And quite simply, this is to defend against the idea that an attacking trench raiding party, providing they're not trying to get in absolutely silently, is usually going to throw a handful of grenades into your section of trench, let them go bang, and then storm in. You have to remember as well, one of the big purposes of trench raiding is not necessarily to kill everybody, certainly to do some damage to the enemy, but quite often it's to actually bring a prisoner back. And so that's why we see some of these non-lethal weapons. The famous rounders clubs with a bit of lead hollowed out into the end to give it a bit of weight. Yeah, it's a great way of knocking somebody out. Might not necessarily kill them, but it will certainly subdue them enough to get them back across no man's land. And these are, of course, part of the bigger intelligence gathering picture of the Great War. But what I think we shouldn't lose sight of here is the fact that both sides are constantly innovating, constantly evolving. And it's usually one improvement on one side that drives a reaction on the other, which in turn, of course, is going to now need a further improvement on that side. And in this way, we just see that continuation to really 1918. Things are vastly different to what they were at the start of the war.
They absolutely are. And we've touched on this many times in the series, that there are soldiers who fought in 1914, still in the front line in 1918. And what they must have made of the changes that they had seen in 4 years of war is fascinating. Some soldiers who write about this experience after the war do dwell on it. I think in particular of Frank Richards' Old Soldiers Never Die. He'd been a pre-war British soldier, fought all through 1914, right to the end of 1918, had an amazing war, an incredible experience, really. And the war had just completely changed. The nature of combat, the nature of equipment and so forth was unrecognizable. I mean, absolutely remarkable scenes and remarkable stuff. And so much of that had been driven by this tit-for-tat need for innovation. And it brings us to a concept that I find really interesting, the idea that the moment the opposing armies go into contact with one another, they're locked into a race. And it's a race for who can innovate faster and sustain those innovations. And your tit-for-tat example, I think, is really important, really interesting, because one side gets a small advantage, then another side compensates and gets the advantage instead. Then another side gets the advantage. And there's this constant innovation and contest about who can come up with the better equipment and, crucially, who can implement it. Because it's one thing to just have a great idea, a great concept. It's another thing, can you actually manufacture this economically? Can you manufacture it at scale? Can the soldiers use it? Because if you give a soldier a very complicated piece of equipment, they're going to break it. They're going to need a lot of specialist training to use it. And what's interesting to me about innovation in the First World War is lots of great ideas come through, lots of things are introduced. But by 1918, you're looking at armies where they've gone through a crucible of combat. And the equipment they're using by 1918 is battle-tested, it's battle-hardened, and it's got this crucial combination of, is it useful, is it portable, is it reliable, it's not going to break or jam frequently, is it manufacturable at large scale, can it be used with a reasonable amount of training? Yes, there's going to be specialist troops with specialist equipment, but for the regular Tommy or the regular German soldier, or the regular French or American soldier, can they use it after being given basic training? And if you look at the kind of equipment a British platoon is taking into battle by 1917, these are weapons that weren't common in 1914. So in a British platoon, you will have a hand grenade section. You'll have a rifle grenade section. And we haven't really mentioned rifle grenades, but effectively you fit a grenade on the end of your rifle. There's a specialist launcher, and it serves as a very short-range, lightweight mortar. And you've got light machine guns as well, the Lewis gun in the British Army, for example. These are weapons that were not around for the British in 1914, and yet now they're completely standard practice.
I want to bring in a quick word here, actually, about our friends, the Doughboys, the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, who come over in really start in 1917, but in big numbers since the middle of 1918. And I think one advantage that really they've got over other nations, and this I think comes down in certain parts to being able to understand the experience, not just of your own troops, but also other allies' troops. Now, let's we won't for any second say that the Americans come in and get it absolutely perfectly right the first time. It simply doesn't happen. But one major advantage they do have is a much closer relationship working with the French army than the British troops do. If you imagine you've got the French in the line, the British in the line, the Americans to an extent straddle both of those lines. And this is a real major advantage for the American army in the Great War generally, because they can understand, they can engage with, and they can learn about the experiences and if you like, the innovations that have gone on the Western Front from both sides. They can also pick the best weapons. There are American units with, I think there's 2 American divisions, perhaps, who serve attached to the BEF, the earliest 2, and they're going to be armed with British weapons. They're going to use British tanks. But at the same time, you've got American units flying French aircraft. they were able to compare and contrast these two and pick the pick of the litter. So you get to see that the Americans not only are fighting with the most effective kit on the Western Front, they're also making a big deal about learning the best lessons from both the British and the French. And it really does help. And actually, they are going to bring out a number of weapons which are going to revolutionize warfare, at least in the latter months of the Great War. One of those is going to be quite simply using the shotgun in a trench warfare scenario. It's going to be a really big deal having a 1918 trench shotgun, and a controversial one as well, Spence.
It is. And this is, of course, the advantage the Americans have is that they're arriving later in the war. And I'd love to get into this in a future episode, how the American army observes what's going on in Europe prior to its own deployment, because there's definitely mixed attitudes. There's some Americans who say, absolutely not. We don't need to learn anything about what's going on in Europe. We're going to show them what's for. I have to say that type of American officer gets the stuffing knocked out of them fairly quickly. But there's others who say, well, let's try and learn the best we can from the British, and especially the French, and adapt and introduce and use these techniques and these weapons. And great example, you've already said about different equipment the Americans use. The American armoured branch uses British heavy tanks and it uses French light tanks, combines the two. Really interesting approach to armoured warfare. And of course, it's not just the bigger picture stuff that they have. As you've mentioned, trench shotguns. And trench shotguns, fascinating subject. There's examples of British, French and German soldiers going into action with shotguns, but these are generally double-barreled shotguns. The hunting shotguns, effectively, they're good in trenches because you're at very close range and you give somebody both barrels as they come around the corner, you're going to do serious damage to them. The Americans, though, have standard issue trench shotguns. The first army in the First World War to actually have these, and they're very good at clearing trenches. There's a lot of stories that come out of the use of trench shotguns, and the American press, which again is another fascinating subject, how the American press reacts to the First World War. The American press, better than perhaps any other nation at creating stories and generating stories and creating myths that endure to this day. And one of these is that the Germans officially complain about the use of trench shotguns and say that they are a crime and this sort of thing because they inflict such horrendous wounds. You know, you're being hit by slugs at really close range. They're going to blow enormous holes in you. It's fatal. You're going to inflict fatal injuries. And the American press, I should say, promotes this idea, the Germans hate these trench shotguns and they've complained about them. Now, I'm sure the Germans do hate trench shotguns, but if you consider the violence, and we've come back to this many times on this podcast, the violence of fighting in a trench. Personally, I'm not sure if you're a German soldier, whether you're going to really be that upset about a trench shotgun when the alternatives are being mutilated by grenades, being shot at point-blank range with standard firearms, or indeed being killed by some spiked knuckle dusters or a club or an axe. And it's quite interesting that the trench shotgun assumes this legendary status in American trench fighting. One of the reasons for that, though, is because it's a uniquely American phenomenon. Yes, other nations do use shotguns informally, but the Americans use them as standard, and so it sets them apart. And that's a story in itself, the fact that certain nations really adopt and make big use of particular items of equipment, and that becomes very associated with their armies. So innovation is going on in all armies, but some armies focus on other aspects or focus on particular aspects in a way that other nations don't. And trench shotguns, for the Americans, I think, is a great example of that.
Yeah, I think you'd have to work really hard to find something to be that offended about in 1918 with all the other horrific methods of killing people having come before. So why trench shotguns would stick out more than any other weapon, I don't know. But I mean, you can go back and look at other weapons that are, I suppose, a great example of innovation along the front lines generally. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on this one, Spence, because I know it's going to be very soon a subject of an entire episode on this podcast. So we're going to, of course, be talking about gas in the near future. But I don't think we can really talk innovation on the Western Front without talking about gas, because it's so closely tied to that idea of trying to break the deadlock of trench warfare. And this, I think, listeners, at the very basic level, is exactly what's been trying to achieve with innovation all throughout the Great War. How do we get our guys from point A to point B with either A, lots of them alive, B, lots of them not tired anymore, or C, the enemy stopping us from doing it? You know, there's, of course, lots and lots of different ways to consider that. And one of them is gas warfare. And that's brought about really quite early on. So April 1915, perhaps even slightly earlier with non-lethal gases, we see them used. But what's, I think, most remarkable as far as innovation goes is some of the, and these are going to sound particularly cold-blooded, I think, some of the later combinations that are used, perhaps in 1917. So one of them that sticks in my mind, particularly Spencer, has been a brutal innovation, is once phosgene, which is really the most deadly of the gases that's used in the Great War, comes along. Of course, there's a countermeasure made to that. It's going to be a type of respirator, which is semi-effective against it. What is introduced as a result, though, is a sneezing agent. That sneezing agent can perforate enemy masks, and what it's going to do is cause you to take your mask off, therefore get gassed by a much more lethal substance afterwards. Particularly brutal way of killing somebody, of really trying to get the upper hand in trench warfare. And from a humanistic point of view, I think we're maybe sometimes we look at the idea of innovation, we look at it from a fairly detached point of view. But one of the things I think is always worth coming back to is actually what it was like for these guys who were to find a new weapon for the very first time that in many cases they've got absolutely no defense against.
This is a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up, because in this episode we've been talking approvingly, really, of innovation, and soldiers are trying to innovate and create things, but we forget that there always has to be somebody who's exposed to this weapon for the first time, and that's human flesh and blood. I'm reminded particularly of the experience of British and French soldiers the first time they're attacked by flamethrowers. We've not mentioned flamethrowers, but they're an innovation of the First World War. Both the Germans and the French will make big use of man-portable flamethrowers. British don't tend to go for them so much. And the experience of being literally set on fire and burned alive is an appalling one. And it creates, of course, an appalling psychological shock, because some gout of flame blows over your trenches. You've never seen this before. You don't know what's doing it to you. And it inflicts appalling wounds and death. And that aspect of the war is one where we must remember that there is ultimately human lives are being taken by these innovations. And the need to generate responses to them is to protect these, protect yourself from casualties. And your comment about phosgene gas and the interactions between the race between poison gas and gas masks is a great example from the early successes with the Germans have with chlorine gas. Of course, no defense to them, to then this battle between who can generate the most effective respirators or gas hoods, and how can you overcome it? And I'm reminded of the German attack on the 21st of March, and indeed it'll be repeated throughout the spring offences, where they use a type of gas attack that the British codenamed Double Cross, which is, as you've described, it's a twofold bombardment. They fire what is called Blue Cross shells, which contains a vomiting agent, and it can penetrate Allied gas masks, and it'll induce vomiting. So you're vomiting into your gas mask, appalling experience. All you want to do is pull your gas mask off, but at the same time you're being bombarded with so-called Green Cross gas, which is at least lethal asphyxiant. So you either vomit into your mask and endure all the horror of that, or you pull your mask off and you're asphyxiated. And the Germans use a mixture of this to try and overwhelm Allied defenses, with some success, it has to be said, because the only solution to that is you endure and you just hold your gas mask on, even though you're being sick. And of course, that's degrading your physical capabilities as well. And yes, I think sometimes we can say, what an interesting innovation, a flamethrower, what an interesting innovation, poison gas, etc. But there's ultimately a human cost to all this as well. And to be experiencing these weapons, which are so new and are previously the stuff of science fiction, is so hard on the soldiers. If you think you might be a soldier from a rural part of Britain, France, Germany, America, Italy, anywhere, and then suddenly you're exposed to all the power of industrial warfare, flamethrowers, poison gas, tanks, aircraft strafing you and bombing you. Imagine what a psychological shock this is. And in the 21st century, as we look back and we see the First World War and the Second World War and subsequent wars, we're so much more used to the technological horrors, really, that come with war. But in the First World War, this is new. This is breaking new ground. People, I think, intrinsically know warfare is violent and it's dangerous and it's deadly. But this is not only dangerous and deadly, it's also horrifyingly new. And that the soldiers endure this and ultimately fight to the finish, and certainly the Allies ultimately triumph, a fascinating subject in itself, and perhaps one we could look at in a future episode, Dan.
Yeah, it's the famous big story of the Great War, as far as I see it. At least it's not necessarily the bravery of those lads going over the top and charging towards the enemy and clearing enemy trench lines, as we know, of course, is incredibly deadly. For me, it's just the fact that they managed to stay there, the fact that they endured day after day. And it's, I think, tragically, Spence, is something we're seeing right now. In fact, innovation generally, we could argue really that battlefields are the birthplace, but certainly the laboratory of innovation. When the stakes are so high and the numbers so great, you inevitably see innovation, whether it's defensive, whether it's offensive, certainly in that tit-for-tat nature. And we're seeing it right now with off-the-shelf drones in certain parts of the world being used to really to revolutionize the battlefield. And no doubt that's going to continue into the future. But, spare a thought for those guys in the First World War, as you rightly say, who are the first to experience it. Sometimes it's the last thing they ever experience, to be the first guy to find out that if you take off your mask, there's actually a deadly asphyxiant mixed in with that vomiting agent. People just don't know that until it happens. And so, as far as the soldiers of the Great War, and it's true of all nations, I think, and maybe something we should reinforce here, the fact that they pursue and put up with and stand by their comrades in this scenario just continually amazes me. And, it's one of the reasons I love talking about the Great War and remembering these individuals that took part in it. Just a remarkable story. And, no doubt, Spence, as we go on through this series, there'll be plenty more examples of innovation that mix into the other subjects we're going to dip into in the future. But, there's so much to choose from. We're only skimming the surface at the moment. There's lots of exciting things we've got coming up. I don't know, you and I were talking just before this, we started this podcast today, about things that we might cover in the future. Give us an idea of a couple of bits that are in your mind, at least.
Well, where do we start with all this? So there's so much we can really get into on this. And I noticed that some of the comments that have been posted on previous episodes, one or two listeners have said, probably with a wry smile, if you make every episode where you've said, I'd love to get into this, then you'll be listening to episodes for the next 50 years. And there is just so much to cover. And I think in this episode alone, I've said about 3 or 4 times, I'd love to get into this in more depth. But a few things just to sort of get into, I'd love to cover trench raiding, because that's almost the battle in miniature. It's fascinating in itself. It's a new form of warfare in many ways. It generates lots and lots of tactical and technical innovation. We've already mentioned need for close combat weapons and how it develops from just a small group of pretty determined individuals to trench raids that sometimes take place with hundreds or even thousands of men involved. And they become miniature battles and a way for armies to test things out. I think that's really interesting. I'd love to put more attention onto the other nations of the First World War. I know some of you listeners have said we'd love to have something on the French, something on the Americans, maybe even the Germans. And certainly I'd like to look at those armies, because those armies are following the similar trajectory to the British, of course, but also they have their own unique differences. They fight their own battles. They have their own experiences. And that's a fascinating story. Particularly, I'd say the Americans, because they arrive late. They have a very brutal learning curve, very steep learning curve, and they're unique compared to the British and the French because they've arrived so late on the Western Front. So there's that to cover. I'd like to get out of the Western Front and look again at aspects of war in the air, like Zeppelins. I'd look to aspects of the war at sea, like U-boats. And that's just scratching the surface, Dan. There's a few off the top of my head. But what about you? What are you looking forward to?
Do you know, as you said it there, I was just thinking I'd love to do a series, a deep dive on the Americans. A bit like we've done at the start of this series where we looked at the major battles in which the BEFs engaged in the Great War. I'd love to go back and look at Catigny and Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne and all of these major American actions. But, really, guys, we're going to be driven by what you want us to cover. If you want us to cover a certain subject, by all means, drop us a message, let us know, leave a comment wherever you're listening to this and say, this is a subject we want us to cover. We've got no shortage of time. There's plenty of stuff to cover in the future. Some of them easier, some of them a little bit trickier, but I'm sure we will have plenty of options. And, please, just to finish off, do drop in those comments, questions, considerations, suggestions. They're really what drive us when it comes to selecting what we're going to cover in this podcast. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
And also, I thought it sets up for loads of things in the future. So,
yeah, that's true. Should make a note of these at some point where we've said, "Oh, we'll cover this, we'll cover that."